Hey everybody, this is Roberto Blake of robertoblake.com helping you create something awesome today. So in today's video, we're going to talk about DSLR cameras and shutter speed. Now, shutter speed is one of the three components of the exposure triangle. It's going to help control your overall exposure. The faster a shutter is going, the less light is coming in. The slower a shutter is going, the more light is coming in. That's kind of obvious, but there are other things that shutter speed affects, and we're going to talk about that here. Now, the exposure triangle, for those of you who are new to DSLR photography and video, talks about the three components that help make up your exposure, which is your ISO, which controls the sensitivity to light overall of the camera, as well as affects grain/noise. And then, of course, there's shutter speed, which is the speed at which the shutter is opening and closing, which affects, yes, the amount of light coming in, but also the ability to capture motion, to get stills, or to have motion blur. And then, of course, there's aperture, which also is how wide the lens opens up, which is, again, controlling how much light is coming in. So obviously that affects your exposure, but also it controls the depth of field of your images. So whether your images are going to be all in focus or if it's going to drop off with a blurry background or foreground, what have you. So that makes up the exposure triangle, which I will do an in-depth video on. But with regard to shutter speed, again, controls those two things. Based on your shutter speed, if you have a fast shutter speed, for example, let's go ahead and turn the camera on real quick. And let me show you something. This is a really slow shutter speed. I have it at 1/10. That was a slow shutter speed. Let me crank that up to 1/1000. See the difference there. Now, if you have a shutter speed of something like 1/10, because of your own natural hand movement and camera shake, especially when you're holding down the shutter, the odds are that your image is going to end up having some blur on it, especially if there's an object that's moving. That's going to be extraordinarily blurry. If you want to capture something like a dancer or an athlete, you want to shoot at something like 1/1000, 1/2000. With a shutter speed like that, I could do something like I could shoot at the ceiling fan here and I could make it freeze at something like 1/1000. But if I have something like 1/50 or 1/25, then we're going to see the motion blur. We're going to see the fan blades moving, whereas the light bulb might be, still, the fan blades are going to be moving, versus if I have it at like 1/1000, 1/2000, something like that, then they're going to stop motion. They're going to be frozen in time without me having to use a flash. So this becomes really important if you're doing something like shooting sports photography. And this is also why in the exposure triangle it matters, because if you're shooting sports photography, the odds are you're shooting that indoors. So you need a really good lens. You need something like a 70-200, or you need like a 300mm lens, all at f2.8, right? And the reason is because, well, low light situation, you're going to have a fast shutter speed, 1/1000, 1/2000. That means you're not getting a lot of light in because of the fast shutter speed, but you need to at least have maybe a higher ISO, which having a camera body that can handle that without it being super noisy is important. And then being able to have a nice wide aperture like f2.8 or f4, so that, yes, things that need to be sharp are still sharp. You're not fumbling around with autofocus as much. You need those things, and that's where having quality camera gear, that's where having a very good, possibly a very expensive lens comes into play if you're doing that. And you need to capture those moments, and you need something fast, so you need a faster lens. That's why you have the f2.8 instead of something that has variable aperture. You're like, oh, I've got fixed aperture, it's going to be consistent. I don't have to change my settings. I'm only changing my shutter speed, and then if I change my shutter speed, I bump up my ISO. I don't have to change all the settings in my camera shooting manual. That's why this is important. That's why we learn about the exposure triangle, is because we can then adapt in manual mode to get things like sports photography on the fly and adjust to those situations. Now, if you're just shooting a regular portraiture shot, then you could do something like 1/125, and you will probably have a super tack sharp image because Your normal hand camera shake won't be an issue. You're still letting enough light in. It's probably fine. And then you have a lot of flexibility in your settings at that point, especially if you're outdoors. But if you're outdoors, maybe you need to compensate for the fact that it might be very bright out. You might want a shallow depth of field, like maybe you want to shoot at f1.8 and have a lot of bokeh in your background. I do this all the time. And maybe you don't have an ND filter to cut the light. You could always bump up the shutter speed so that you can still have your low ISO, your wide aperture, and you could shoot at 1/2000 or 1/4000 to make sure that you're getting rid of enough of the light with a fast shutter speed to compensate for the exposure there, and then your image isn't going to be overexposed. That's a primary example. Now, if you're shooting indoors where there's less light, and for whatever reason, let's say that you can't bump the ISO but so far because it's going to get super grainy and you don't want all that noise in your shot, in theory, you could do something called dragging the shutter. You could go down to something like maybe 1/50, 1/25, but then you could use the pop-up flash, dial it down a little bit as far as how intense the flash is, and you could then meter off the ambient light. The flash will create the freeze frame moment that you need, and it won't be overpowering because you'll have the ambient light to meter off of, and then you still have what you need in terms of a shot. And this technique works very well in low light situations. You can get some tremendous shots by doing this. So when you use it as a fill flash to do that with a slower shutter speed, it's a great way to handle low light situations, get exactly what you need, and it can create a tremendous shot. And understanding how shutter speed works and how these techniques can be applied in different situations is important to get out of auto and to master the exposure triangle. So to recap, when you want to capture a still image of something moving super fast, you need a higher shutter speed. But understand that if you have a higher shutter speed, that you need to adjust your other settings to compensate for the lack of light that is being created by that higher shutter speed. You need to bump up your ISO, or you need to use a wider aperture in order to compensate. And then you need to make sure that you're doing that in such a way that everything is properly exposed. If you need to handle a low light situation, you might need to have a slower shutter speed, and you might need to use the dragging the shutter technique with the flash in order to meter off the ambient light, still use fill flash, and get the shot and keep it sharp and still and freeze framed. When you're hand holding, you could use something like 1/80, 1/125 to still get a tight, nice shot without any problem and without any camera shake from your natural movement. That's fine. The two things that shutter speed is going to really allow you to do is either to get a freeze frame if you want it, or to be able to adjust and compensate for the amount of light, either letting more light in or letting less light in to the camera to handle your exposure correctly based on the context of the situation. Anyway, I hope you guys understand shutter speed a little better now. If you still have questions, leave those in the comment section. I'll try and answer as many of them as I possibly can. And I will also try and cover more of this in my exposure triangle video, so make sure you're subscribed and staying tuned for that. Anyway, like this video if you like it. Don't forget to subscribe. Check out the other awesome content on the channel. As always, you guys, thanks so much for watching, and don't forget, create something awesome today.